We are going to continue this morning in the book of Ecclesiastes, and this morning we're going to tackle one of the most well-known, often quoted poems in all of the Bible, chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. And I got everyone's note. I know the Beatles didn't sing it, it was the Byrds. I got it. So that was helpful. I don't know where I was. I was maybe sick at school that day that they told me that, but I, for some reason, thought it was the Beatles. But interesting, I got a lot of emails this week, had a lot of fun reading through just even the history of that song, and so thank you. It was awesome. And now we get to dive into the Word of God this morning. So, one of the things that we want to do as we study through the book of Ecclesiastes is we don't want to take like individual passages as just standalone entities. There's a flow of thought that Solomon is developing here, and that's what we want to try to pick up. Actually, that's what we try to do in any Bible study, right? We want to understand the context, where he's going, where he's coming from, and those kind of things. And one of the things that we're gonna see this morning, I think, in this poem is this. Oftentimes in our lives under the sun, this horizontal life that we live, there are individual scenes like acts in a play, scenes that come up that bewilder us, that confuse us, that cause us to maybe question God's character, God's intentions toward us. There's lots of things that happen in our lives involving these individual scenes. And I believe that the passage that we're going to look at today basically says, you know what, guys? God's in control. And we may not like everything. And it's not that God expects you to like everything in the sense of enjoy pain, enjoy sorrow, enjoy when things don't go your way in life. It's not that at all. But it's to give you a divine perspective that when those things happen, he's still in control. He still has it all together. He still has it all figured out. And an old saying, it's probably been used too much, but it's a good way to explain it, is I don't know what the future holds, but I know who holds the future. And that's, I think, what we're going to see in the passage today. And one of the things that's interesting about this, jump down to verse 11. I want to kind of give a foreshadowing. Here's the great thing about our God. If you've ever thought, man, I don't understand why God allows this. I don't understand why he does this. I want to ask, has anyone ever said, when I get to heaven, I want to ask God, why? Fill in the blank. Why this? Why that? Yeah, and it's okay. Raise your hand. I'm raising my hand. I've got some questions for God too. Here's what's really neat about that. That's okay. That's okay. God can handle your why questions. You're never going to back God in the corner where he doesn't have the answer for you. And notice verse 11. We jump down in chapter 3, verse 11. It says, he has made everything beautiful in its time. That is the Romans 8:28 of the Old Testament right there. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. You know that he has put eternity in your hearts. He has put a desire for you to figure out how things fit together. But you know what? We're not God. So there are going to be times in our lives where there's going to be a tension, where something happens. We don't understand why God allowed it, why this happened to us. But you know what? Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 8 is to encourage us, you know what? God's still in control. God's got this thing all put together. And so let's dive in this morning to this important passage of Ecclesiastes. Remember verse 1 says this, to everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. And it's often these very seasons and these the timing of these things that bewilder us in life. That confuse us, that upset us, that frustrate us. All of these things that happen under the sun, we can't really put our minds together. But one of the things that we see is that everything, there's a season. This word season simply means appointed time. There's an appointed time that God allows things to happen in your life. Even when trials hit, do you know God has allowed that or appointed that as a time where that particular trial would hit? And see, what the author is encouraging us here, I think, is to grab hold of divine perspective on life. You know what human perspective is? Every time something difficult hits, I want it gone. Every time something difficult or challenging strikes me, I want out from under it. That's human perspective. Divine perspective says, wait a minute, I do want this gone. That's a natural response. But maybe God's got something in this for me. Not maybe. He does have something in this for me. And taking that divine perspective on life allows us to enjoy life for that season. You know, going back to the overall context of the book, understand what Solomon is doing. This is wisdom literature for the nation of Israel. And what is he trying to accomplish here? Well, he's trying to teach the nation how to think with divine wisdom, to have divine perspective. And think about life. The whole position that Solomon is taking here is for young men to learn how to make decisions, for young women to learn how to make decisions, for young men to learn how to lead the nation, for young men to learn how to lead their tribes, their cities, their towns, their government. And you know, all of those things take a sense of timing, don't they? There are times where you do things, and there are times where you don't. There's times where you stop, you know, and it's like, in our politics today, it's like our politicians view every problem as a nail, and they're the hammer. And that's how we try to solve every problem in our political scene. That's not wisdom. Sometimes there's a time to pull out something besides a hammer. Sometimes the problem isn't just a nail. It takes a little more delicacy to deal with. This is what Solomon, I believe, is trying to explain here. By implication, as we see from the text, there's someone or something who sets these appointed times. There's someone who appoints it, something who appoints it. And I think by implication, we know that this is God. God is the one who decides these appointed times. And we'll talk about something that comes up with that in a second. But what we got to understand is, as the text tells us, this is true of everything. Everything that we encounter in life, there's a appointed time that God allows. We'll talk about that in a second. I don't believe God causes everything, because then we would make God the author of sin. But he does allow things, and we live in a sin-filled world, and he's restraining evil up to a point, but he's not restraining all of it. Evil will be removed when sin is removed and conquered. But he is restraining evil. That in itself should be scary, because that means it ain't as bad as it could be, even right now. That should be frightening in and of itself. When we talk about this appointed time, what we're going to see is that there are going to be seasons and times in life that appear to contradict things. Maybe contradict God's character, maybe contradict what we've learned about God in the past, maybe contradict that we did this before and we got this result, and now I'm doing this and I'm not getting this result. And we're trying to make sense of life. But even with all of that going on, we've got to understand that doesn't mean that life is meaningless or has lost its purpose. God is still in control. Not only is there an appointed time for every event, but there's an appointed time for every delight. This word purpose means delight, what we take pleasure in. You know, and I've said this before throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. It's not that God doesn't want you to enjoy life under the sun. He does. The problem is when we try to find that enjoyment independent of the Lord or relationship or fellowship with the Lord, that's when we run into problems, because that won't satisfy. And that's what Solomon has been looking at in all of these dead-end streets that we've looked at up to this point. You know, that phrase, under heaven, again, refers to life specifically on this earth. And, you know, when he talks about a time and a purpose for delight and enjoyment, you know, it's just a real practical example that we can relate to. You know, ice cream cones are really good. It's just not good timing to eat them before dinner, right? Now, none of the kids in the room understand that concept. They're like, what? Why not? Cotton candy, ice cream, whatever I want before dinner. But we as adults understand that, right? There's a time for an ice cream cone, right? It's after dinner. Or if you want to skip dinner and just pound an ice cream cone, that'll work too, you know, as you get at a certain place. But there's a time for that. There's a time for delight and enjoyment. There's a time to hold back from that. And what he's saying is there's a time for every delight under heaven on this earth. There's a time to enjoy this life. And God establishes what those times truly are. What Solomon is saying is that life is not a bunch of random, chaotic events. If you view life as random, chaotic, not having sense, doesn't mean anything, you will approach life through a fatalistic lens. Who cares? And you know, a lot of people will say, even Solomon says, oh, eat, drink, be merry, and then you die. That's not the message of the Bible. It's eat, drink, be merry, and enjoy the Lord while you're doing it. Enjoy those things as gifts from the hand of God, because those are designed to be there for you and I to enjoy. I mentioned this earlier, but you know, many times God gets accused of a lot of things, and I'm not here to defend God. He can defend himself. But you know, to make the comment that God does not cause everything, but he does allow certain things to touch everyone. You know, I can imagine just even in this room that at some level, each of us have been touched by the death of a loved one, a friend, a family member, right? Those are things that God doesn't cause, but we obviously know that we live in a sin-filled world where death is a consequence of sin. And so everyone experiences death, but it doesn't mean that God causes those things. He allows those things. In fact, what has God gone out of his way to cause? Well, he sent his only begotten son so that we can have life. He doesn't send his son into the world to condemn the world. The world's already condemned. He sent his son into the world to give the world life if they'll simply put their faith in him. And what's better, living 130, 140 years on this earth or living for eternity? I mean, when you put that in the scales, obviously the better deal there is eternal life, not a longer life on this earth. So the list that we're going to look at this morning is almost a comprehensive list. This is a lot of under the sun activities that many of us experience. And you remember we said last week that he uses a poetic device called merism, which is designed to compare opposites and give us this comprehensive feeling as if he's covering everything that possibly we can face as human beings. And what he's saying is there's an appointed time for all of this, that the Lord himself is involved in. It's these very events, when taken independently of each other, that seem to make no sense at times. And this is why philosophers across the centuries have looked at life under the sun and really come and been depressed and been fatalistic. It doesn't have any meaning. We can't find purpose. We can't find the true value of life. This is where it comes from, because it's just observing these things that we're going to look at and say, this doesn't make sense. You're born, you die, and you live in between. This is just crazy. You lose this, you get this. This is ridiculous. This makes no sense. I build this up just to tear it down. I tear this down, but then I'm going to rebuild it. And all of these things individually look like life doesn't make sense. So Solomon's argument is that these very things should convince us that God is God, we are not. Basically, these things are not designed to have us think fatalistically, but to have a divine perspective that, you know what? I may try to do these things, but God is ultimately under control. And we all have to get to a place where you say, you know what? I'm okay with that. I'm good with that. In fact, I'm not okay and good. I am thrilled that he's in control and I'm not in control. That's hard when life starts to hit you where it feels like, you know, the old boxing terminology, hitting below the belt. You know, that life sometimes feels like you're getting hit below the belt. And that is a hard truth to believe and to grab hold of when you feel like you're being mistreated and mishandled. And yet, don't doubt in the darkness what God has revealed to you in the light. And these are some of those truths that we need to hone in on and sink our teeth into and never let go. Never let go of these truths, that your God loves you, that your God cares about you, that he's got nothing but good in mind for you. There are bad things that happen in this world, but he wants to work those things together for good. He wants to turn all these things and make them beautiful in his time. And you know, God is about the beauty, the beautification of the believer in Jesus Christ. In fact, he's conforming us to the image of Christ. That's beautiful. That's a beautiful look on each one of us. And so let's keep going, because we're going to look at this list and we're going to move quickly through some of these and slow down on others. But clearly in verse 2, he says there's a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck what is planted. And so a time to be born and a time to die. Very clearly, our birth came on a day in human history. Our death is also going to come on a future day in history. Everyone is part of this ultimate statistic. 10 out of 10 people die. It's just kind of the way it is. But what's really cool for the believer of Jesus Christ, there's a generation that won't die. That's called the rapture of the church. That's an exciting thing that we look forward to and hope that we're part of that generation. Then we don't have to physically die, but everybody else does. In fact, Job tells us that all of our days are numbered by the Lord, that if you ask the Lord today, what day am I going to die? He knows that day. There's a time to be born. There's a time to die. And as it relates to Solomon's point, man can't control either of these events. I have just over the course of my life have known many different types of people in the world. I met a guy one time in his 30s, morbidly obese, ate anything that he wanted, had been obese. I didn't actually know him in his 30s, but he had been obese since his 30s, ate anything he wanted. Cheese, hamburgers, I went to Denny's with him one time and he ordered a sandwich. It was moons over my hammy. And when they called it back to the kitchen, they said, "Give me a heart attack on a plate." That's what they called it. The Denny's waitress called a heart attack on a plate. This is what this guy ate. And this guy got into his 80s. I was like, that guy should have a heart attack. Then I knew another guy who was in his 50s, who ran, jogged every day, worked out. He would hit on the speed bag at the gym, and really, you didn't want to mess with him. The guy could fight, it looked like it anyways. He dies of a heart attack playing basketball in his low 50s. And you see, we can't control those two dates. You didn't control when you were born. Your mom may have thought you did, by the way you were kicking or holding out, you were going way past the due date. But that time was appointed. And just like the death, our time is also appointed. In an agricultural sense, there's a time to plant and there's a time to harvest. And this would have made a lot of sense, obviously, in Solomon's day, where that was the primary mode of work for the average person. And one of the things that we realize is that with farming, there's a lot of time, there's a lot of process, there's a lot of obstacles, a lot of stimuli that happens in between planting and harvesting. And I know farmers would love it, if you just dropped the seed in the ground and just came back 6 months later and pulled it out. It just doesn't work that way. You've got to water it, you got to keep bugs off of it, you've got to fertilize it. There's lots of different things that go along the way. So even though a farmer may specifically decide the day he'll plant and harvest, he's still subject to the laws of nature established by God. You couldn't ask a farmer today, when are you going to plant your crop next year? He wouldn't know. He'd say, well, about, mid-March, maybe early April, just depends on, and he'll start giving you all the variables that he's got to keep an eye on that are outside of his control, that God has got in his control. And it might vary different regions in the country. And so we see that this is, again, designed to give us this idea that there are appointed times that we have no control over. But we want to be okay with that. That's the point. It's not designed to create fatalism like, why should I even farm? I don't even know when I can plant. I don't even know when I can harvest. That's not the goal of this section. It's designed to give us a divine perspective and say, okay, God's in control. I'm fine with that. Just wait on the Lord. Now we get to verse 3. He says there's a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to break down, a time to build up. And you think, man, when is there a time to kill? When could that be a good thing, right? Well, when you look at this word, I think it's wise to point out that in the Hebrew, this word kill is not the same word translated murder in the Ten Commandments. It's two different words here. And I think that distinction should be helpful, because it's not like Solomon is saying, there's a time to break the Ten Commandments. There's just a time to break the Ten Commandments. I don't think so. I don't think that's what he's saying at all. In fact, the distinction is interesting, because the word kill speaks of taking the life of any creature, whether that's animal life or potential human life, whereas the word murder specifically refers to taking human life, okay? And I think we could even go so far as that there's the word murder refers to taking human life in an inappropriate way. So it kind of explains or it alludes to there's an appropriate way to take human life. So when would that be? Well, for animals, I think it's easier to see. If an animal is sick and dying and going to die, maybe you put the animal out of its misery. That would be a time to kill, according to Solomon. Hunting for food. Sorry if I'm offending any of the vegetarians in the room, I'm sorry, but God gave us animals to enjoy for food, And so hunting for food. What about self-defense? What about if a bear is coming out of the woods for one of your kids? That's a time to kill. I'm just going to have to take that bear out. Hopefully you get it in the right place and you can turn him into a rug, and then you can get some double benefit out of it. But there's a time to kill. Defense of an innocent. This is all as it relates to animals. Some of this is similar with humans. Self-defense. If someone breaks into your house and is threatening harm on your family, that would be a time to kill. Maybe you would try other avenues first, but that would be a time to defend. Protecting innocent lives. Again, protecting children or people, elderly, who cannot fight back. Capital punishment by the government. We see that in Romans 13, that God gives them a sword to bear. That's referring to capital punishment. That's a time to kill, and obviously in times of war and protection of personal property. And so these are the times for killing. But you know what? That doesn't mean that we abide by that all the time. Some people is like, that's their answer to everything. And in fact, some religions for the extreme, and that's their answer for everything, is to kill. There's also time for healing. There's a time to heal. There's times when it's appropriate to rest and to heal up, either from sickness, disease, injury, even emotionally. And this helps us to understand that life is full of different seasons. There's a time for great increase. There might be a time for great relaxation on your couch, not doing anything. It reminds me of a story. Some of you may have heard this name, John Nelson Darby, kind of a prolific Christian writer and teacher. He was the man he didn't invent dispensationalism, but he categorized it and systematized it so it was understandable. But one of the things they said about John Darby is there was one year he was an itinerant Bible preacher, and this wasn't in the days of the air-conditioned Honda Accord, where he's driving around the country. He's on horseback, and sometimes bumpy buggy rides. And they say that there was a year where he preached something like 350 sermons in 1 year. So do the math, 365, 350. This guy was doing a lot of preaching. He was going around evangelistically. He was talking to different groups. He was all over the country, and that was his pace for many years. Well, 1 year, he came down with a pretty serious illness, and he had to be bedridden. He was so sick, he had to lay in bed, and he thought, my life is worthless. My life is meaningless. I'm not doing anything from the Lord. I'm just laying in bed. And so you know what John Darby began to do? He began to take up a pen and a piece of paper, and he began to write. And he began the sermons that he would preach, he began writing them down. And he began writing and writing and writing. And there may have been thousands of people that heard John Nelson Darby preach, but there's been hundreds of thousands or millions that have read his books. In fact, he did an entire translation of the Bible. This man became a prolific writer, and I think it was this verse that encouraged him. You know what? I'm in a season of healing, and God can still use a season. And this is so important to understand, because there are people in this body who don't come out anymore because they're now shut in or they're infirmed in some way. And you know what? It doesn't mean that they've lost value or worth. They still have value or worth. It's a different season now. And you know what? That's okay. And you know what? Each one of us needs to take that in our thinking, because that may be us someday. And don't write yourself off as if you have no value to the local church because you're shut in. There are seasons that God allows, and it's okay. It's good. It's His appointed time for you. And so don't fear those days. Rejoice. Start talking to God. What am I going to do in those days? What's God got planned for me? This is exciting. It's like a roller coaster blindfolded. I don't know what's coming next, but I know I'm going to love it, right? That's the mindset that we need to take into life. And so just to encourage you there, see, life is never about keeping the same pedal to the floorboard the entire existence of your life. God many times will slow you down for your benefit for a season, and it's okay. It's good. It really is. It's really good. He goes on to say in verse 3, there's a time to tear down or break down. There's a time to build up. Breaking down describes something that's intentional. There's a time for intentional destruction. And there's times in life where this is appropriate. We see this is true of buildings. That's pretty clear. When buildings get outdated, eventually they need to be torn down. They're too dangerous to leave up. But it's also true of plans. How many of you have had a plan in your life or an idea that you thought was the greatest thing, but at some point you realize that just ain't going to work? And you have to tear it down. You just have to put it to the side. It's not going to work out that way. And you know what? It's okay. There are times we need to tear things down in our thinking. We may not get to those. This is true of some relationships. Some relationships we need to have boundaries, and we need to move away from them because they're unhealthy. They're unhealthy. And there are times where that's true. And so this is also true of our thinking in times. There are things that I would venture to say that for many of us who have been old enough to say 20 years ago, there were probably ideas that we would die on a hill for. And today we think back and say, that was foolish. Why would I have died on a hill for that thing? And there's ways that we tear down, we destroy some of these ideas even word. And the key word here, by the way, is there's a time. Meaning that this should not be the dominating characteristic of your life. If you look back, it's like boating, right? If you're driving a boat, you're pulling a skier behind you, and you look back to look how the skier's doing, and you've run over another boat, and you've got boaters out in the water because you've ran into them. You're just leaving this carnage in your wake. Many people, that's what their life looks like. Every person they interact with is somebody drowning in a lake because they've run over them, hit them, just caused damage. So if this is what the dominating characteristic of your life is, it indicates that you're carnal. It indicates that you're walking by means of the flesh. It indicates that you're out for number one. And so that shouldn't be the dominating, but there are times where there's a tearing down, not of other people, but of potential relationships, plans, those types of things. But in contrast, as Solomon relates, there's a time to build up. At the same point, at the right time, there may be a time to rebuild. There may be a time to reconstruct even some of the things that have been torn down. And sometimes God may allow things to be torn down so he can rebuild them the right way. Many times I think if left to ourselves, we would try to build onto something that's already fading away, that's not safe. You would never do that on a building. If the foundation was poor and there was a second level on it, you would never say, oh yeah, well, it's fine, let's go up and build that third level. No, you would tear that down, you'd restart with a new foundation. So there are times for that in life. Now, we get to verse 4, and it says that there's a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance. And when we talk about weeping, we're not talking about just crying. We're talking about true weeping. I don't know if you've ever, hopefully you haven't, but maybe you've seen it on a movie where somebody cries and it's coming out of their gut. They just almost can't even control some of the noises that are coming in. They're just so grieved. That's what we're talking about here. And yet at the same time, there's a time to laugh. And you've probably been around someone who laughs and they have kind of the same weird noises coming out, similar anyways. And it's this uncontrollable laughter. And the seasons of life when that happens. And sometimes what's ironic is they can happen at the same time sometimes, which is very ironic, but there's a time for that. And so it's interesting that both of these produce sometimes uncontrollable sounds. Now, weeping is obviously appropriate. in terms of the right time when people are sad or mourning. Laughing is obviously appropriate at some time of enjoyment. I remember one time, I can't even remember the situation. I just know it was an inappropriate time to laugh, and I got the giggles. That's the worst. That's the absolute worst. But so we want to exercise this at the right time. And as I mentioned, sometimes it's appropriate and okay for both at the same time. I have to tell this story because it's kind of therapeutic for me too. But so I lost my dad earlier this year. A lot of you know that, in February, to Alzheimer's dementia. And when we moved him here, he was still pretty high functioning. We put him in an assisted living facility just down the road here. And I just remember shortly after moving him in, and it was hard. It was hard to see my dad. I mean, he was he was one of my best friends. He was a weightlifter. He was just a great man. And so it's hard to see him start to deteriorate. But I remember one time I got this phone call, and this was shortly after we moved him here, and he called me and said, "Hey, Dad, how's it going?" He said, "Well, it's not going very good." And I said, "Oh, man, what's up? What's happening?" He's like, "Well, I think somebody has stolen all of my underwear." And that was my reaction. But I had to keep that low on the phone. I'm just thinking to myself, no way. So I said, "I tell you what," I said, "before I run over there and we find out who did this to you," it's kind of going along with him. I said, "Do me a favor, go to your dresser drawers, the drawer that's got the TV sitting on it, go to your second," because I'd put all his clothes away, so I knew where his underwear was. So I said, "Go to the second drawer down to the left and check that first, and if it's not there, then I'll come over there and we'll figure this out." And he was just like, "Oh man, praise the Lord, it's all there." And that was therapeutic for me. That was a time to laugh. And I wasn't laughing at my dad. I loved my dad, but it helped me deal with some of the grief that I was going through. But it was just kind of fun. And so in light of all these events spoken of in verses 2 and 3, these different emotions and these appropriate times, they ring true. We can point to areas in our life where this was an appropriate response and when the exact opposite later was an appropriate response. And that's what we're looking at here. Now, verse 4, we also see that there's a time to mourn. There's a time to dance. And this, again, goes with what we're talking about, weeping and laughing. Mourning, includes weeping often. It does. A time to dance, a time to leap, skip, be excited. It kind of has this idea of something that is great that's going on. And so mourning is obviously the appropriate response at the loss of a loved one, and with the actions mentioned in verses 2 and 3. And so as we're looking at these lists, and this is, again, trying to get the big picture context here, just to kind of keep that in mind, so we're not just going through a list. Understand that trying to isolate events or certain emotions, isolating those incidences in our life, and then trying to make an overarching declaration or assumption about what the purpose and meaning of life is, that's not a wise thing to do. That's the whole point. There are times for all of this in life. We're all touched by these things, but it's not just one individual scene that gives us the ability to understand the totality of the meaning or purpose of life. And I think that's what the encouragement is here from Solomon. And so verse 5 says there's a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. And this analogy here, we don't understand. I was like, throw away stones. Like, what? When have I ever done that except when I'm skipping rocks on a lake? I don't throw away stones. I don't even get that. Well, understand this, that in this society, stones had to be cleared from a piece of land in order to farm it, in order to plow and plant. Now, maybe farmers in our day understand this, but this was what they would have to do to prepare land to be tilled and to be planted and to get an increase from that land. And in fact, in Old Testament times, stones were often used by enemies to hurt an enemy. They would go out at night and they would throw stones on somebody's land that they're about to farm because it would create more work for them and make that land at times unusable. In fact, one of the things that the Lord says through the prophet Isaiah to King Jehoshaphat is when they conquer these people, throw stones on their land. Like fill their agriculture with stones so they can't be used. And then in Isaiah 5, 1 through 2, he talks about preparing a vineyard, about getting those stones out of there, throwing them out. And so this is the picture that we have here. And so there's obviously a negative use for stones, but then there's a positive use for stones, right? There's a time for this. There's a time for chunking them and getting them out of here. And there's a time for using them for our benefit. Gather means to collect them, to collect a mass in a single place. And stones in and of themselves are neither good nor bad. It depends on what you use them. It's kind of like if your enemy fills your land with rocks, don't throw them back, build something with them. And that's kind of the idea that's thrusted. There's a time to build those. And, you build retaining walls. You build drainage beds. Sometimes you build pieces of furniture or walkways with stones. If you want to see something like that, just go outside these doors, make a left, and see that beautiful retaining wall walkway that Caleb Buchanan put together. There's a great purpose for stones, and that was a great time to do that too. That was a great time, the perfect time to do that. Verse 5, he also says there's a time to embrace. It means to hold in one's arms, to show close association and affection. And there are times where embracing someone's appropriate. Maybe at a funeral or memorial service, we embrace. This is more than a hug. This is a holding of someone, a holding up sometimes. An embrace of a husband and wife, that's an appropriate time. Husbands and wives, Hebrews 13 says the marriage bed is undefiled. Just there's some enjoyment in husband and wife intimacy in terms of embracing. There's a time for that. There's a time for mother and father with their child. There's a time after long absences, when you're out of town and you see your loved ones again. You hadn't seen them for a while. It's the embrace, the holding. Wow, it's so good to see you. There's an appropriate time for that. Oftentimes in private, this is always an appropriate show of affection. But there are times that it's not appropriate to embrace, and every father that's ever had a teenage daughter understands this completely. Pretty much, if you date my daughter, it's never a time to embrace until I say so, right? So that's the deal. But there's a time to refrain from embracing, and that means to be far off. It means there's a time to not do this. And some of the more obvious examples is two young people prior to marriage, possibly that there's probably some inappropriate embracing that could happen. And so want to avoid that. Obviously, you don't want to be embracing somebody else's spouse. That's an inappropriate time. That's a time to refrain from embracing. And also there may be times where two people where it's okay for them to embrace, but in public, maybe they refrain from embracing. Maybe it's a time for that where they don't embrace. In fact, I had a buddy of mine whose son just graduated from Army boot camp down in Fort Benning. He was there for 10 weeks, so he's gone from the family for 10 weeks. And as they showed up at the site for his graduation, they had not seen their son in 10 weeks. Now, dads, we miss our sons, but moms, they miss, right? They miss daughters, they miss sons. That's important. So they get to the Army barracks and they let them into the Army barracks where these guys sleep. And so it's a room full of cadets. They spot their son, and what does Mama Bear want to do? She wants to run up and embrace him because she hasn't seen him in 10 weeks. And he can see her coming, and he's like, this isn't the time for embracing. I got all my cadets around here. And so, although it could have been, it's appropriate for a mom to miss her son, in that setting, it was probably appropriate not to embrace, not to make a big show. And what was really funny is they went out to eat after the graduating ceremony, and she got her embracing there. And that was the appropriate time. And so we continue on. There's a time in verse 6 to gain, a time to lose, a time to keep, and a time to throw away. Again, a time to gain, there's time to acquire things through procuring items or or knowledge. There's times or seasons in our life that we buy or acquire a lot of things for the moment, Anybody that's had a baby, when you had your first baby, you're pregnant, you probably didn't own a crib or a car seat or baby toys or teethers or pacifiers before that day. But there's a time to acquire those things. There's a time to grab those things and put it in. And then as you start having more babies, there's typically a time to get a bigger house with more room. There's a time to acquire. So those are just some practical examples here. But there's also times in our lives where we have a season of great informational acquirement, where we just explode in informational content. We're just sponges, and we can pick up large amounts of information. And there are times like that in our life. And I remember a man who I had great respect for in the ministry. He was spending a lot of time with me, and he said, and I was telling him how much time I was getting to study. I was in seminary. I was like, yeah, I'm studying this, I'm studying that, I'm doing this. And he said, John, enjoy this time. Enjoy this time of unfettered study, because when you become a pastor, a lot of that time is going to be taken away from you doing other things. So enjoy it now, take it all in now, establish the foundation now, because what he was basically telling me is that in his ministry, he had to fight for time to study, to prepare to teach. And it's just kind of interesting that there's a time for this, there's a time for that, there's seasons that we want to take full advantage of in our life. There's also a time to lose. Lose means to destroy, annihilate, exterminate, or to wipe out. You can kind of see that with the boys pushing the books over. And so there's other times when we want to remove things. We want to take something away, stuff that maybe we had acquired or procured, we're going to give away now. Like when your kids grow up, you get rid of the cribs and the toys and the strollers and the car seats, right? Those go away. And then when you have grandkids, you buy it all back again. And then it's just, there's a time, right? There's a time and season for all of these things. And so we see that. In the area of information, sometimes when you acquire new information, it wipes out previously held ideas. I hope that we are that way. I hope that everybody in this room is at some level teachable. We need to remain teachable and humble, not locked into something that we grabbed onto when we were 21 and just hold on to it tenaciously, even though we know it's wrong, right? New information's introduced, we change our mind about what we used to believe, and we begin to believe what's true, what's been shown to be true to us. Verse 6, he also says there's a time to keep or to throw away. And there are times when it's appropriate to keep something, have it remain. This could be true of stuff. There's a lot of kids' artwork that I keep, and someone would be like, oh, that's just trash. Not to me. It's not trash to me. It's precious to me. Now, I don't know where I'm going to put all of that one day. Right now, it's in different places, but it's precious to me. There's times where you keep maybe furniture because it belonged to your dad, belonged to your mom, belonged to your grandparents. And it's like, there's a time to keep things. And it may not make sense to everybody else, but it's okay. There's a time to hold on to things. But there's also times where it's appropriate to throw away, to get rid of things. And, sometimes it's good not to keep them. And you might picture a hoarder here, probably the bag from Chick-fil-A from last week, that could probably go in the trash. Probably. I'm just guessing. I mean, I know it's Chick-fil-A, but it probably can go into the trash, so there's some difference there. There's a time to move on from some of these things. And it's not just stuff, it's people, it's services. Sometimes we hold on to a certain plumber because we just trust them. They tell us the truth. We hold on to a certain mechanic. But then maybe the mechanic sells the business, and then it's time to move away from that mechanic. It's time to move on to somebody else. And so these are all times and seasons in our life. Verse 7 tells us there's a time to tear, there's a time to sow, a time to keep silence, and a time to speak. And when we look at a Jewish culture, the idea of being a time to tear, again, has this idea of grief, of mourning. It represented what was going on, what they were feeling in their heart. Their heart is being torn in two. And so this was definitely a Jewish custom. We see that even in the Gospels, right? Even from the hypocritical Pharisees. Oh, Jesus blasphemed, and they ripped their clothes as they're grieving this great atrocity of the promised Messiah telling them that he's the promised Messiah. What an atrocity. And so they're hypocritical about that. But this was an external representation of what was going on internally. So there's a time for that. In the Jewish culture, there was a time for mourning and grief. There's a time for mourning and grief. But you know what? And this is good news. There's a time to sew it back together. There's a time at the appropriate time. And remember, who's determining these times? It's the Lord. There's a time to move forward. There's a time to sew these clothes back together, as it were. And so at some point, it would be appropriate for the clothing to be sewn back together. This is one of the things I think, as a church, I think as I've just talked to individual people, this church has a really good understanding of this concept. And that is that we understand that people grieve differently. It takes people certain amounts of time to grieve, other people longer amounts of time to grieve. And that's okay. That process is unique and different for everybody, and that is okay. And we have to understand that there's a time appropriate and it's different for each person. And that's why you should never go up to a grieving person and say, "Are you still grieving? It's been 3 months. It's been 1 year. It's been 2 years. It's been 5 years. It's been 10 years," as if there's some defined time that people can grieve. Just know that it's appropriate for each person. God's got that under control. We can trust him for that too. And so there's a time to tear and there's a time to sew. Somebody might start sewing after a year. Yeah, I'm going to put these clothes back together. I'm ready to move forward. Somebody might not even have their sewing machine out for 10 years. And that's okay. That's okay. We want to walk through people along their own grief process according to the timing that the Lord has established for them. There's a time to keep silence, not to speak. There are times where, as an old country song say, you say it best when you say nothing at all. Just be quiet. Ironically enough, tying it into the immediate context, it may even be appropriate. He may be tying this, or this may have been a trigger when he's thinking about grief. And there are times, as you grieve with someone, it's best just to be there in physical presence and not say anything. Job's friends, I've got Job up there, they actually did a great job of this. If you go back and look at Job 2, 11 through 13, they sat down with him, they realized how much Job was hurting and grieving, and it says they sat with him and remained silent for 7 days and 7 nights. Wow. If we do it for 7 minutes, we feel like, this is too awkward. Like, I got to say something. And I think there's a lot to learn about, from Job's friends there. Although they didn't continue walking in that, they eventually got frustrated, and it did feel like a million years, their silence. And they began to accuse Job. But there are times to be quiet. Just some examples of times to be quiet. Correcting somebody publicly when you could wait to do it privately. That's probably a time to be quiet. And just do it privately. Challenging someone in the wrong setting. That's something you learn as a respect piece. Even in college, there's certain times that professors, you just don't challenge them publicly. You wait privately to ask questions. Now, if they're really obnoxious and they're asking you to challenge them, well, go for it. Let it fly. Challenge them. But there's times where you don't. That would be a wrong setting. It's a challenging of authority. When you're not in authority, they are. And there's other examples of that. This is huge. When you speak into a situation where you do not have all the facts, that is an epidemic, speaking of epidemics, of biblical proportions. To talk into a situation, to give an evaluation, to give a judgment based on not having all the facts. And we do that all the time when we have two parties that are at odds with each other. We only know one person's side, and we are body slamming the other person. We don't even know what's going on. We don't even know what's happening behind the scenes. We hear one side of the facts. Everyone gives slanted side of the facts. That's just the way we are. We're all that way. It's not that you're a bad person if you do it or a good person if you don't. We all slant facts toward our favor. It's just naturally how we roll. But the point is, if you don't have all the facts, don't speak into the situation. It's just really easy to say, you know what? I'm sorry for you. I don't have all the facts. I don't know what to say. And be okay with that. That's the time to be quiet. Situations where you have no authority or no relationship, there's times to speak. There's times to, even when you're uncomfortable, you need to speak up. You should speak up. Like, that's what you need to do. You can't keep quiet. Examples of this, parent to a child. Parents, you got to talk. You got to speak up. You have to take charge. You have to communicate with your kids. You can't just let them run roughshod on you. You've got to speak up. So that's an example. Standing up for someone who's innocent, who has been wronged. When someone's broken the law, we have a responsibility to speak up. When someone's in danger, situations where you're the leader, you're there for a reason. You need to speak up. Verse 8, time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. And you say, wow, there's a time to hate? Yeah, we'll get there. But a time to love. A love, again, we know what love means. It's an affection based on a close relationship. Part of our problem as believers, and I think even problem in Solomon's day, is it's really easy to love someone when they're lovable, when they're acting lovable. Really hard to love someone when they're not acting lovable. The problem is that's the very definition of true love. That's the very definition of agape love. And when we talk about love, it's a choice to act in the best interest of an object being loved. And I would even say better yet for the Christian, as we've worked our way through Romans 6, which is so key, 6, 7, and 8, love is a result of a choice, really, to by faith present your bodies to the Lord as those alive from the dead. Because in that moment, you're walking by means of the Spirit, and the Spirit of God is the only one who can produce agape love. It's the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5:22. It's His fruit that He wants to produce in and through us, so we can only exhibit it as we're walking by means of the Spirit. And so there's a time to love, obviously. And by the way, in certain relationships, it's always that time. It's like a broken clock on the wall. It's right twice a day. But in marriage, and family, it's always time to love. Always. That's always the time that the minute hand is on. Then there's a time to hate. Hate means exactly what we think it would. And I think it relates especially to sin, injustice. There's a time to hate. There's a time to hate in the cause of disruption in the local church, someone who's being unruly or divisive. And then finally, our last opposites that we're comparing is war and peace. And again, there's a time to go to war, protect your interests. There's a time not to go to war, to have peace. And so as a concluding point, none of these individual seasons, this is what we want to take away from this, I think, this morning. None of these individual seasons means that God is not in control or that He doesn't care. And that's how we naturally respond to some of these seasons. If this is happening, then God must not care. If this is happening, then God must not be loving. It's actually designed to say, you know what? As seasons happen, God wants us to draw our attention upward and say, God, what do you have in this for me? I know that this is something you've allowed. What are you trying to accomplish in here? Rather than just taking a horizontal view of all of these individual seasons of life, trying to encapsulate all of these individual seasons with a divine perspective as we walk through life. And so my prayer is that individually we would do a better job of that. I think we could enjoy the Lord much more fully if we can grasp hold of those truths. So let's close with a word of prayer. Lord, I do thank you for your word and just the way that you care for us and communicate us. Lord, may we just take what you are teaching us and apply it in our daily life and show us where that is. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.